Welcome to this episode of the Good for America podcast. I am your host, Bob Good, former congressman from Virginia's 5th District, courageous conservative warrior, and former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. I want to remind you to please subscribe to the podcast, follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good, and rate the show and share it with your friends. This show is titled Our Nation's Fiscal Crisis and the Big Ugly Bill. We do and we will talk a lot about money, spending, the deficit, and the debt on this podcast because, again, it is always and only about the money in Washington. As has been said, show me your checkbook and I'll show you your priorities. And nowhere is that more apparent than in Washington, D.C. In Washington, it's all about what we fund or what we don't fund because the money is the policy. Nothing else really matters in Washington or in Congress. And yes, if you don't already know it, we do have a debt crisis. We do have a fiscal crisis in this country. You're not free. You're not truly free when you're massively in debt. Debt diminishes freedom. This is a biblical principle. Proverbs 22:7 says the debtor is a slave to the lender. Perhaps you know this from your own personal experience, but debt reduces your options. And unfortunately, debt increases your obligations. And we as a country, we have a $1 trillion interest obligation on an annual basis. In other words, the payment on the interest on our debt is about $1 trillion a year, and that's about $3,000 per American citizen, about $10,000 per taxpayer. Worse is what we're doing to the next generation because every dollar that we borrow and spend in this country, that our Congress borrows and spends supposedly on our behalf, it is either it's either a tax increase currently, it's a tax increase in the future, or it is a cost to us in inflation and lower purchasing power with the reduced value of our dollars. Let's talk again a little bit about the growth of the debt and the fiscal crisis that we are in as a country. This bears repeating, and we're going to keep talking about this. It took us 200 years to get to $1 trillion in debt as a country. We didn't get to $1 trillion in debt until about 1980, at the end of the Carter administration, beginning of the Reagan administration. But now we sit at $37 trillion. So we've had $36 trillion in the last 45 years when it took us 200 years to get to $1 trillion. And the debt has doubled in just the last 10 years since 2015, meaning in 2015, 10 years ago, it was only about $19 trillion. That has been on an accelerated pace, particularly over the last 8 years. During the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, and the Biden administration, they each increased the debt by about $8 trillion, obviously with the help of Congress. And while Democrats are better at spending money than Republicans are complicit too. Republicans at least feel bad about it, I guess, or pretend to anyway, because they talk about it, where the Dems don't even really talk about the debt or haven't in a long time. But currently in this new administration, and we're 5 months in now, spending, the deficit, the debt, they're all higher than they were a year ago. So Republicans have full control of government. The party of so-called fiscal responsibility, or the so-called party of fiscal responsibility, is actually spending more than we were a year ago. And that's not because they've added so much in the way of new things, so much as they haven't made any changes relative to when Democrats had full control of government, or even the last 2 years when the Democrats had the Senate and the White House, the Republicans only had the House. We may well increase the debt by $10 trillion in this second Trump administration based on the pace that we are going right now. The deficit's going to be over $2 trillion this year. It's projected to be even higher next year. So just take that over 4 years, and you're looking at $9 or $10 trillion in increase, which would be a record if we continue on the current pace. Our debt to GDP. Now, GDP is the size of our economy, our gross domestic product, all the goods and services we produce as a country. We have the largest GDP in the world. Our GDP is somewhere near $30 trillion, but with our debt being about $37 trillion, our debt to GDP, that ratio is the highest it's ever been since World War II. And think about that now with what has been going on in the Middle East and the volatile situation there, and what has happened with the a war between Iran and Israel and the U.S. involvement, and how that could obviously escalate and get out of hand, if other countries got involved, if China or Russia, North Korea, so forth, got involved. But how would we fund a World War III when we're coming into that kind of a crisis in the situation we exited World War II? How would we fund, how are we going to fund future natural disasters, hurricanes and wildfires and floods and things like that? How do we fund the next health crisis when you're carrying this amount of debt? And again, maybe you've experienced on a personal level that when you have a heavy debt situation and nothing in the way of savings or cash reserves, that's the situation our country's in. It's tough to weather a storm. That's why it's so important to have a rainy day fund, to have a savings account, and to not have any debt that's not absolutely essential. That's a conversation for another time on personal levels. But our debt is on track for over $60 trillion in the next 10 years. In other words, we're at $37 trillion now, and over the next 10 years at over $2 trillion a year in spending, just do the math, that's 20-something trillion. We're on track to be over $60 trillion in debt in the next 10 years. And that's without a crisis. That's without any special emergency type spending, which always happens. And the main topic at hand today, the big ugly bill, as I call it, is gonna make all of this worse as it currently stands. But before we get to the big ugly bill and talk about the particulars and where that stands today, with respect to the debt crisis and the fiscal situation in this country, why doesn't Congress seem to care based on their actions or inactions? Why doesn't the president seem to care? Do our elected officials on the Republican side, and I put the blame primarily on Republicans. Yes, again, Democrats have been worse in history. FDR really started all this. LBJ accelerated it. But it's been Republicans who's continued it just almost as bad as Democrats over the last 40 years or so. And it's because they don't believe that there is a fiscal crisis? Do they not believe the fiscal crisis matters, or do they just simply not care? Is it simply because they don't think it's going to hit the fan, or the consequences are going to set in, or a fiscal collapse or an economic collapse is going to happen while they're in elected office and they don't think it'll happen before they leave? I would submit a big part of why they don't care is because there are no electoral consequences. They're not suffering at the ballot box. They're not suffering when it comes time for re-election because of their spending and their failure to deal with the deficit and the debt. Why do we let our elected Republicans do the same things to us that Democrats do when it comes to spending, when it comes to the deficit and the debt? Why don't we hold them accountable? Why don't we primary weak, spineless, spend-happy Republicans in the primary season? Why do we even bother to elect Republicans and fight for Republicans if they're going to do the same things as Democrats? The House Ways and Means chair, Jason Smith from Missouri, who's running point for the House on the big ugly bill, I served with him over the previous 4 years, and particularly 2 years when he was the ranking member, which means the senior member for the minority party on the budget committee. I was on the budget committee for 4 years, first 2 years under Jason Smith, who was the ranking member. And when the Democrats had full control of government during that time, and we were in the minority party, he talked a great game. He talked about the fiscal crisis. He talked about the deficit and the debt. He talked about the trajectory of that. And he talked about the cost to us today and the cost to us in the future and the egregious nature of that. Where did that guy go? Because he's not talking about that as he's pushing the big ugly bill, and he's just parroting the White House talking points about passing it no matter what's in it. Mike Johnson, the current speaker, seemed like a fiscal conservative before he became speaker. Where did that guy go? Where did Jason Smith, the one who was a fiscal hawk when he was the ranking member on the budget committee, where did that go? The question I would also ask is, when has anyone ever lost an election for cutting too much, for reducing government too much? I can't think of a time that's ever happened. Of course, you might say, well, that's really never been tried, at least not by Congress at large, not by the White House. Maybe we should try that. Maybe we should see if we can cut too much and it costs us at the ballot box, that we can shrink government too much and it costs us at the ballot box, that we can actually be too committed to doing what we said we would do when it comes to spending the deficit and the debt and see what happens. The big ugly bill, this reconciliation bill, as it's called, should try to do that. I want to remind you that the reconciliation bill is optional. You don't have to do it. It's a tool that's when the majority party can use when they have full control of government to pass things without 60 votes. Almost everything else that Congress does year-round takes 60 votes in the Senate. So since Republicans only have 53 votes in the Senate, they can't pass whatever they want without getting 7 Democrats to come along if every Republican votes for it, except with reconciliation. And this is a tremendous opportunity for Republicans to make a difference, to get something positive done for the country in terms of addressing the number one crisis, the fiscal crisis, the number one threat to our country, domestically at least, the debt, the spending, the deficit. And matter of fact, Republicans promised last year, again, I was still in the Congress, that they would address the debt and reconciliation. I was there. We started talking about reconciliation last summer, a year ago, all through the fall, what we were going to do if we had full control of government, how we were going to address the spending and the deficit and the debt. We made bold claims about that in reconciliation. As a matter of fact, when Mike Johnson, as the speaker, was passing all these continuing resolutions, where he was surrendering to Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden and saying, oh, well, we can't do anything because we only have the House, and we can't shut down the government, so we got to go along. But hey, it's going to be different. We have full control. And then when he passed that CR, continuing resolution, in December, and the next CR in March, breaking promises with both of those, and continuing the spending that's bankrupting us, he said, well, it'll be different in reconciliation. As we look to the midterm elections next year, just some 16, 17 months from now, that should be motivation to Republicans to do it now in this bill. But instead, Republicans don't seem to want to do anything because of the midterms. They don't want to show courage and show principle and show the courage of their convictions by cutting spending and shrinking government. But doing Republican things might actually just save the midterms. And even if it's true that you might lose the midterms for doing the right thing, then do it now. Do it while you can, because we don't know what's going to happen in 26. We don't know who's going to be sworn into office in January 27. What we know is Republicans have the House, they have the Senate, they have the White House, and they can do whatever they want with respect to the spending with this reconciliation. But the sad truth is that most Republicans are not truly conservative. Almost none of them are courageous, but most of them aren't really conservative, but they just play conservatives on TV. What do Republicans have to show for 2.5 years of control of the House in terms of dealing with spending, debt, deficit? I would submit nothing. And what are Republicans really reversing from the last 4 years of what Democrats did to the country? What are they advancing in terms of the Congress? What bold changes are they making? We're going to allow Republicans just to slow the bus down that's driving off the same cliff. The Democrats are driving off the cliff at 95 miles an hour, and we're content to have Republicans drive us off the cliff at 95 miles an hour. The Democrats are going 100 miles an hour. The Republicans go 95, and we'll settle for that. Why is keeping bad Republicans in office more important than saving the country? But the big problem with the big ugly bill is the failure to address this fiscal crisis. It's not so much what's in it as it is what's not in it. It's not so much what it does as what it fails to do. I support extending the tax cuts from 2017, President Trump's tax cuts from his first term. I support more new tax cuts, but the number one issue is to deal with the debt, the spending, and the deficit. And Republicans, again, do a great job talking about that when Democrats are in control. But now Republicans are told by the president and by Republican leaders and by the Trump first media, just pass the bill, irrespective of what's in it or what's not in it, regardless of the consequences to the debt, just pass it and do it by July 4. July 4 is a made up artificial deadline. There's nothing special about July 4. But Republicans are being told, hey, just pass it. Just vote for it. It doesn't matter. And matter of fact, they're being told that while the Senate is working on it right now, while the Senate is expected to finish work on it this weekend, Republicans are being told to vote for it when we don't even know what they're voting for. But they're told, hey, if you don't vote for it, you don't pass it by July 4, then you're unpatriotic. You don't support President Trump. And the narrative is, hey, 77 million people voted for Congress to do whatever President Trump says. Put your principles at the door, put your opinion at the door, put your convictions at the door, put your voting card, surrender it to the leadership, and just vote for this because that's what President Trump wants. Again, without even knowing what exactly they're voting for. The House passed their version now, something like a month ago, by one vote, 215 to 214. No one even read the bill. It was over 1,000 pages. They waived the 72-hour rule, which isn't enough time to read 1,000 pages anyway. They amended the bill up into the wee hours of the night, the early morning hours as they were working on it still. And then they had a vote in the early morning time where it was only completed 2 or 3 hours. So obviously no one read it. No one knew what they were voting for. And I've often said when I was in D.C., I wasn't too worried if I hadn't read a bill that I knew I was going to vote against. I don't own the bill if I vote against it. But if you're voting for a bill, you own everything that's in there. And my former colleague from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, apparently just figured that out because she had that infamous post after the bill was passed, which she voted for. She voted for it, I guess, out of loyalty and surrender to President Trump, irrespective of what was in or out of the bill. But she said afterwards, hey, I wouldn't have voted for it if I would have known that it contained a provision prohibiting states from being able to regulate artificial intelligence or AI. She said, if I'd known that was in there, I wouldn't have voted for it. And she's threatened at that time not to vote for it if it's still in there. We'll see whether or not that stays in there and whether or not she votes for it. But the House version that passed about a month ago projected to add about $4 trillion to the debt over 10 years on top of the $2 trillion a year that the debt's going up as it stands now. So the $25 trillion, the debt's going to increase over the next 10 years. The House version that passed a month ago was projected to add about $4 trillion to that, or to make it $4 trillion worse. And that was with tax cuts. Again, some of the funny math and the gimmicks that Congress does, that was with the tax cuts that were in the bill, the 10-year bill, expiring after the first 4 or 5 years, when you know they're going to be added in and cost more money in the second half of the 10 years. And a lot of the spending cuts were backloaded, so they didn't kick in until after President Trump's term. So a future Congress could come back and not even, or could cancel out or limit those spending cuts because they don't want to do it because it might not be popular. So it would be even worse than the $4 trillion. But the Senate version, which they've had it now the last few weeks, is going to be worse. How much worse, we don't know because we don't have a final version yet. The Senate is blaming the parliamentarian, the sort of rules arbiter, on what they can or can't do in reconciliation. And frankly, the parliamentarian is doing what the Senate leadership wants the parliamentarian to do, because the parliamentarian answers the Senate leadership, the Republican leadership, who could fire the parliamentarian. So I think they're just having the parliamentarian say things are ineligible or can't be included in reconciliation that they don't want to do anyway. I'll remind everyone, this is Harry Reid's parliamentarian. They've been in place for now 13 years, and they were on the staff of the previous parliamentarian before that. But they should fire or overrule the parliamentarian. Congress can do whatever Congress really wants to do. The majority party can do whatever the majority party really wants to do. And they could overrule the parliamentarian. They could fire the parliamentarian. They could even have J.D. Vance as president of the Senate in his role as vice president, sit in the chair and overrule the parliamentarian. But the Senate version, we do know, weakens the primary spending cuts that were in the House version. It weakens the cancellation or elimination or reductions of the IRA, Inflation Increase Acts, climate credits, the subsidies for wind and solar and electric vehicles, which are in the over $1 trillion. The Freedom Caucus fought to eliminate much of those in the House version. The Senate reduces those cutbacks, and then the Senate reduces the Medicaid cuts. The Medicaid is now about $1 trillion a year. It's exploded by about 50% since Obama was president. Most of that growth is for able-bodied, working-age adults who don't have dependents, which is not what a Medicaid was originally intended to be. Medicaid was originally intended to be for disabled folks, mothers of young children and poor children, and poor pregnant women. But now, in the current Medicaid, you don't have work requirements for Medicaid. Biden took those out. The Democrats took those out over the last 4 years. Illegals are getting Medicaid. And the Senate strips away a lot of the House cuts to Medicaid. And again, a lot of the House cuts to the climate subsidies, both of which total about $1 trillion each. And the Senate increases the debt limit by $5 trillion instead of $4 trillion. So the House version had the largest debt limit increase in history of $4 trillion. The Senate's is actually $5 trillion. But what are Republicans told in the House? Just vote whatever the Senate votes out this weekend, this week, coming week. Just pass it. Just vote for it. And the real problem in Washington on the Republican side is the DCAC. That's a new term I've come up with. The DCAC, kind of like AC/DC backwards. DCAC, which stands for Don't Cut Anything Caucus. There is a Republican Don't Cut Anything Caucus or Republican DCAC in both houses. The Don't Cut Anything Caucus. And it is one of the biggest and certainly the most powerful Republican caucus. And the Don't Cut Anything Caucus can operate with impunity. You never hear them threatened or pressured by congressional leadership or by Republican President Trump. The DCAC, the Don't Cut Anything Caucus in the Senate, doesn't even want to pass the little tiny $9 billion rescissions package that passed the Senate a couple of weeks ago. Excuse me, that passed the House a couple of weeks ago. Again, $9 billion is about 0.1% of our $7 trillion budget. And the House finally voted to cut something a couple of weeks ago when they passed this, which was defunding public broadcasting, defunding about $8 billion in foreign aid. And the Senate can't even pass that at this point because of the DCAC, the Don't Cut Anything Caucus. It's in the Senate. The DCAC, Don't Cut Anything Caucus, wants to continue the congressional gimmicks, the funny math, the deception. They don't want to cut the Inflation Reduction Act's climate credits that we talked about. They don't want to cut Medicaid. They don't want to cut public broadcasting. They don't want to cut foreign aid. They don't want to implement the DOGE cutbacks and eliminating agencies and departments and getting rid of federal workers. They don't want to pass future rescissions packages. They don't want to cut anything. But where are the threats to them from the president and from the leadership of the Republican Party? And for that matter, have you heard of any threats of the SALT guys? The guys in New York and California, New Jersey on the House side that have been fighting for to take the 10,000 SALT cap that was put in place to help pass for the previous tax bill in 2017 that limited deductions for state and local taxes to $10,000 on an annual basis. They want to make that unlimited. They settled for $40,000 in the House version, and they're threatening not to vote for it if the Senate takes it out. The Senate says they're going to take it out, and these SALT Republicans are saying that they're not going to vote for it. Where's the attacks against them and the threatened primaries that Thomas Massey's getting and that Rand Paul are getting? But the fact is, President Trump just wants anything passed so he can declare victory. He just keeps calling it the big, beautiful bill, the greatest bill in the history of the country. Nobody's ever seen a bill like this bill, and he doesn't even know what's in it or what's going to be in it ultimately. He has not read it. But when has anything good happened fast in Congress? When has rushing something in Congress ever made something better? For that matter, when's Congress really ever done anything to help you or make your life better or do anything good for the country? But President Trump just doesn't seem to care what's in or out of the bill or what the bill does or doesn't do, as long as it has his promised tax cuts from the campaign trail. no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, which are expanding the tax code, by the way. They're going to be very complicated to implement and to comply with for everybody. And he just wants those new promised tax cuts, and he wants the old tax cuts extended, and he wants the debt limit increased. I like Rand Paul's idea on the debt limit, where he has said, why don't we, instead of raising it $5 trillion with no spending cuts, why don't we raise it just a few $100 billion and negotiate spending cuts over the couple, 3 months that would last before we raise it again? And he can only get a handful of Republicans in the Senate to join him on that. Of course, the DCAC, the Don't Cut Anything Caucus, is very much against that. But just screaming to pass a bill, just pass it no matter what, no matter what's in it or no matter what's not in it or what it does or doesn't do, that is not a principle. Passing a bill. Passing a bill is not conservative in and of itself, and usually it's the opposite, by the way. You probably don't need a very long sheet of paper to list all the conservative bills that have passed Congress and been both houses and been signed by a president. We would be better off if the First Amendment ended with Congress shall make no law. Of course, the First Amendment protects our rights to religious freedom, and it starts with Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But as my friend Chip Roy said once we were in an event together, we'd be better off if that First Amendment said Congress shall make no law. Because the less Congress does, the better. Most of what Congress does is bad. And in terms of just passing a bill, Congress is going to pass about 1,000 bills this year. And with respect to this bill, President Trump said this week, hey, it's something in it for everyone. I used to hear that when I was in Washington about a big, massive omnibus spending bill or a minibus or whatever it might be. Hey, there's something in this for everybody. Everybody can vote for it. And that's not good in Washington. That doesn't usually mean something good. That usually means we're growing government, we're increasing spending, and that's what the big ugly bill does. The bill can't be about legacy building for President Trump. It can't be about legacy building for Jason Smith, the primary architect in the House, or Mike Johnson as the Speaker. And again, this supposed July 4 deadline, that's artificial. It doesn't matter. It's terrible to pass whatever you're going to pass just to meet a false deadline. The current tax cuts don't expire until December 31, the end of this year, and you have multiple opportunities to do reconciliation packages. You can do this package later. You can do more than one. I would suggest, and this is not going to happen, but Congress should just pause work on the big ugly bill and instead focus on these 12 appropriations bills that are due by September 30. Here we are again. The House has passed one. They passed what's called MILCON VA, Military Construction and VA. They did pass that this past week. But there's 11 more to pass, and we're not hearing about those. The one that they did pass increased spending by about 5%, by the way. Of course, that I'm sure was with a promise, hey, we're going to cut spending in the other 11 bills, which almost certainly is not going to happen. But they're due by September 30, and Congress is planning to be out next week, be there for 3 weeks in July, take all of August off, and then again, these 12 bills are due by the end of September through both houses. Senate hasn't passed any. Republican House has passed one. Republicans ought to cancel the August recess and work on the 12 appropriations bills, cut a few $100 billion out of the so-called discretionary spending there, earn the trust and the street cred, if you will, to implement tax cuts in the fourth quarter, meaning cut the spending now, cut the spending first in the reconciliation bill, in the 12 appropriations bills, and then implement your tax cuts afterwards in the fourth quarter. That way you satisfy the handful of fiscal hawks. Don't worry about the defense hogs, but satisfy the handful of fiscal hawks, the Freedom Caucus and Thomas Massie in the House, Rick Scott, Mike Lee, Rand Paul, Ron Johnson in the Senate, who are trying to fight courageously to make the Senate bill better or not so bad. But Congress doesn't really do anything in the fourth quarter anyway, so why not work on what they typically do is pass a bad CR or a bad omnibus. Well, you don't have to do that if you pass the 12 spending bills, 12 appropriations bills by the end of September. Then you could spend October, November, even December passing the tax cuts, the new tax cuts, and extending the current tax cuts after you've cut the spending. Be willing to shut down the government to force Chuck Schumer to the table on the 12 appropriations bills, because you do have to have 60 votes in the Senate. Chuck Schumer caved back in March on a government shutdown. I think he would cave in September if Republicans funded government by passing all 12 bills. But I want to pivot to talking a little bit about the Constitution, about what is constitutional from the spending standpoint to begin with. I don't know if you've read the Constitution. If you have not, I certainly encourage you to do so. If you have read it, read it again. It's not very long. It only takes about an hour to read it. It's easy to get a pocket copy. That's your homework. Read the Constitution. I think most people in the federal government have never read the Constitution based on their actions, or they don't care about the Constitution. But the Constitution brilliantly limited the powers and the role of the federal government, and that connects directly to the spending. You hear a lot from Republicans in particular this year about cutting waste, fraud, and abuse. Waste, fraud, and abuse. And I would tell you that's mostly a distraction. That's mostly a red herring. That's mostly trying to divert attention from the real issue. Really focusing on waste, fraud, and abuse is really kind of a joke, because it sounds good. And of course, there is a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government. It ought to all be cut and eliminated. But when Republicans say that, when Republican members of Congress say that, what they really mean is they don't really want to cut anything. Even Democrats will sometimes talk about waste, fraud, and abuse. But waste, fraud, and abuse means we really don't have to cut anything that you like. Waste, fraud, and abuse says we don't have to cut anything that's popular. We're not going to cut the good stuff. Not going to cut the stuff you like. We're just going to cut that waste, fraud, and abuse. That means somebody else. Waste, fraud, and abuse denies the fundamental problem that most of what government does, or at least the federal government does, is wrong. Lots of it's popular, but only a fraction of what most people think, only a fraction of what the government spends our money on is what most people think of as waste, fraud, and abuse. But it is wasteful to keep throwing money after problems without any results. It's wasteful to keep spending a bunch of money with very little in the way of return. It's wasteful, or it's abusive, I should say, to take and waste hardworking taxpayer money. And the fraud is most government programs. The fraud is most government spending. Most of what the federal government spends our money on is not an appropriate, justified, or even a constitutional role of the federal government. Again, that's back to reading the Constitution. Most of what the federal government spends our money on almost always makes things worse. Most of what the federal government takes, borrows, and spends our money on is ineffective and inefficient, the most ineffective and inefficient way to distribute and spend money. Almost everything the federal government spends our money on, takes from us, borrows from us to do it, comes with mandates and regulations and strings that further empower and grow the federal government, and that tramples on the constitutional, state, local, and individual rights and freedoms of you and I as a people. And it all borrows money that we don't have. Only a sliver, or a few billion, of the $7 trillion budget is for what we think of as the egregious hot button issues like spending on abortion or the LGBT agenda or diversity, equity, inclusion or critical race theory, those sorts of things. But hundreds of billions, not to mention trillions when you talk about the mandatory spending on Social Security and Medicare, but hundreds of billions of dollars are borrowed for popular stuff. And when you talk about these kind of things, the spending on education, the spending on Department of Energy, the spending on Health and Human Services, the spending on the things that a lot of people like in government, the EPA or what have you, these discussions tend to expose that many people who think of themselves as fiscal conservatives really aren't, because they like the government giving them free stuff or giving free stuff to other people. And they like the federal government taking care of people. So again, there's no consequence to members of Congress or the president for spending money and worsening the fiscal crisis. It's a little bit like a family who overspends and borrows. It's not all for drugs, gambling, and prostitution. It's far more likely to be for expensive vacations, fancy cars, Christmas gifts, buying a boat, those kind of things that aren't necessarily bad by themselves, but it is bad to spend money you don't have for things you don't need. So to the conservative fighters in the Republican House and the Republican Senate, I want to just continue to tell you that we're behind you. We support you. Keep fighting. Keep standing strong. But it's simply noise if you're not willing to vote no. The Republicans in the Senate, the Republicans in the House who are complaining about the big ugly bill, it's simple noise if you're not willing to vote no. That's the only leverage you have, which is your voting card, your willingness to vote no. Republican leadership in the White House and the Congress, they don't care about your opinions. They don't respect your concerns or your opposition unless you're willing to vote no. And if they know at the end of the day you're going to vote yes because of President Trump or because of public pressure to be a team player or to be unified, no matter what the big ugly bill does, then they don't care about what you're saying about it. I don't believe the moderates, or what I call the mod squad sometimes, will vote no. These guys like the SALT caucus guys or the other DCAC, the Don't Cut Anything Caucus, I don't believe they have the courage to vote no. They simply need to show their folks, their constituents, they're fighting and they're resisting, but at the end of the day, I think they'll vote for the bill no matter what. According to history, sadly, this bill is going to pass in the next week, according to history. And then what Republicans will do is what they always do. They'll promise, hey, we're going to fight next time. We're going to fight this summer in the appropriations bill. We're going to fight with the next reconciliation bill. We'll do more next year. We'll do more after the midterms when we have a stronger majority in the House and the Senate, they hope. And then there'll be more threats to the grandstanders, as President Trump calls them, the conservatives, the fighters, who are standing up against what the big ugly bill does to worsen our fiscal situation. I wonder if Elon Musk will and others will be willing to jump in and help offset the primary challenges that are already been announced against conservative like Thomas Massie, and I'm sure will be coming towards anyone who votes no in the Senate or the House. But we as a people, in this government of the people, by the people, for the people, we do still have the power. The power is in our hands to defend and support the fighters, the handful of fighters, the courageous fighters. It only takes a few with these narrow majorities. The power is in our hands to hold our elected officials accountable. The power is in our hands to make Republicans actually do Republican stuff or to fear the consequences from us. They need to be more afraid about doing the wrong thing than they are about being afraid to do the right thing. That is our role in helping to keep the republic that we've been entrusted by our founders. So thanks for joining me for this latest episode of the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, Bob Good. Please be sure and subscribe to the podcast. Follow me on social media @RepBobGood. Please rate this show and share it with your friends. Let's keep the republic.